The world is becoming a more and more unequal place as wealth is concentrating in fewer hands. The humanitarian organization Oxfam reported that between 2020 and 2023, the wealth of the 5 richest billionaires on Earth more than doubled, whereas 5 billion human beings got poorer. That is, over 60% of the world got poorer. But this kind of inequality is not a product of nature. It is not something that we can't avoid. It is a product of government policy. And the reality is that Western governments in particular are working very closely with the same billionaire oligarchs who are benefiting from these policies and who are creating these policies. The perfect example of this was the G7 summit that was held in Italy this June. This brought together the leaders of the US, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan. And at this summit, the Western leaders invited executives representing some of the most powerful corporations on Earth, including Microsoft and BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager. And together, they discussed policies that they could implement that would make the rich even richer. And by the way, I should point out that among these leaders was the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who himself has hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth, and he is married to the daughter of a billionaire. And also at the summit was the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, who is a multi-millionaire banker. The Biden White House published a press release boasting that the G7 had invited Larry Fink, who is the billionaire oligarch who is the founder and CEO of BlackRock. And they discussed how BlackRock, in alliance with the Western governments, is working on privatizing infrastructure, buying up infrastructure, not only in the West, but in poor countries across the global South, and is trying to use these investments to make their rich oligarch clients even richer. Now, you've probably heard people talk about BlackRock, but maybe you don't understand exactly what this is. This is the world's largest asset manager. But what does that mean? It means that BlackRock manages more than $10 trillion of wealth owned by oligarchs all around the world, and it invests the money of the rich in new ways so they can become even wealthier. For average people, this might be a little confusing because you probably only have some money in your bank savings account. But if you are very rich, you don't simply hold all of your wealth in cash because, one, due to inflation over time, you're going to have a real reduction in your wealth. And two, because even if you're getting a good return on your savings account, even then, all you're doing is keeping up with inflation, but your wealth is not increasing over time. So if you're rich, what happens is that rich people pay other people on Wall Street to manage their wealth, to do new investments that make them even wealthier. And BlackRock is the world's largest investment company. And it not only invests in things like bonds, which is debt, or stocks, shares of companies, partial ownership in companies. Increasingly, BlackRock is looking for other investments, including infrastructure. So representing elite rich clients around the world, it wants to invest in private infrastructure projects, buying up roads and buildings and bridges. And what will it do with these assets? It will charge people money to use this private infrastructure. It will extract rent from them, which guarantees that in the long term, over many years, BlackRock's rich clients will make more and more money while average working people have to pay to use basic infrastructure that is being privatized. It should be public, but it is being privatized. BlackRock is doing this as part of an initiative launched by the US government and the other Western governments in the G7. And this is referred to as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGI. And the US government created this project as an alternative to China's global infrastructure initiative, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. China has been using state-owned construction companies and state-owned banks and multilateral development banks in order to fund and build infrastructure projects around the world, largely in the global south. And China views this as an example of what it calls win-win cooperation. So other countries can develop infrastructure so they can have more economic growth, and therefore they can be a larger trading partner with China. So it's mutually beneficial. But what's important to understand is that China is doing this through state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. There is a very small number of countries in the West that are also participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, but some of them have been leaving, including Italy, for instance, which is governed by a very right-wing leader, Giorgia Meloni. She announced that under US pressure, Italy is leaving the BRI. And instead of participating in this Chinese government-led project, the G7 has created an alternative, which is a so-called public-private partnership, which again is the PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And in the fact sheet published by the Biden White House, they boasted of how BlackRock and other investment companies representing billionaire oligarchs, they are working with the G7 in order to privatize infrastructure projects around the world so rich people can get even richer off of infrastructure, charging rents for poor people in the global south. I'm going to play a clip here of the billionaire CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, speaking at the G7 summit in Italy. And here in these comments, you can hear he says that the goal is to privatize infrastructure in so-called public-private partnerships. What that actually means is that the governments pay the costs and the private companies benefit. They pocket all the profits. So it's socialization of losses and privatization of the gains. And here we can see this scam once again. And in particular, listen carefully. Larry Fink says that instead of having banks, multilateral banks, etc., fund infrastructure projects, we should have capital markets fund these projects. Listen to what he says here, and then I'll explain the implications of that after.
The IMF and the World Bank were created 80 years ago when banks, not markets, financed most things. Today, the financial world is flipped. The capital markets are the biggest source of private sector financing, and unlocking that money requires a different approach than the bank balance sheet model of yesterday. There's still a lot of work to be done, but reform over the past 8 months have resulted in billions of new dollars for the developing countries' infrastructure. That's what you saw last week with the announcement of the Investor Coalition. BlackRock, GIP, KKR, and other major firms will deploy $25 billion in Asia's emerging economies. This is why building new infrastructure is critical, especially through public-private partnerships. Infrastructure investments is a counterforce to the high-debt, low-growth economies.
Now, when I heard those comments from Larry Fink, one of the first things that came to mind is what hedge funds on Wall Street did to Argentina and other countries in the global south. These are known as vulture funds. What they do is they buy up the distressed debt and other assets of poor countries in the global south, especially when they default on their sovereign debt. And then these investment funds on Wall Street, they use the US justice system in order to seize the assets of poor countries like Argentina. This is exactly what happened. Argentina had these sovereign bonds that were sold in international capital markets. Argentina defaulted. However, vulture funds on Wall Street, like for instance, Elliott Management of the infamous billionaire oligarch Paul Singer, who's a major donor to the Republican Party, they use the US justice system in order to steal assets from Argentina, like for instance, naval ships. They stole Argentina's assets and then they used those as collateral to force Argentina to pay them billions of dollars in profits. The UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, warned back in 2014 that Argentina's vulture fund crisis threatens profound consequences for the international financial system. And in particular, it warned that this means that poor countries in the global south can be victims of these vulture funds on Wall Street. And now what we see is that some of these investment companies like BlackRock are calling for expanding capital market investments directly into infrastructure so they can buy up roads and ports and hospitals and schools and other important infrastructure in poor countries, and then they can charge poor people in those countries monopoly rents to make their clients even richer. Now, in this fact sheet published by the Biden White House, they note that the PGI is working with BlackRock chairman and CEO Larry Fink, a billionaire, in order to mobilize private capital for projects. And the Biden White House noted that the G7 is doing this in collaboration with global infrastructure partners, GIP and BlackRock in Brookfield, and they are investing $4 billion in capital toward infrastructure projects in alignment with the PGI's priorities. What is Global Infrastructure Partners? It's just BlackRock. It's a property of BlackRock. At the beginning of 2024, BlackRock announced that it had purchased GIP, Global Infrastructure Partners, which it noted is creating a world-leading infrastructure private markets investment platform. It noted that infrastructure is forecast to be one of the fastest growing segments of private markets in the years ahead. And it noted that there's going to be a huge spree of spending on digital infrastructure like broadband, cell towers, and data centers, on logistical hubs like airports, railroads, and shipping ports as supply chains are rewired. And with the movement toward decarbonization and energy security, BlackRock is going to be investing in more and more infrastructure to extract rent from average working people to make the rich even richer. BlackRock also pointed out that large government deficits mean that mobilization of capital is going to be done through public-private partnerships that will be critical for funding important infrastructure. And this will provide opportunities for investment companies to buy up infrastructure assets to, quote, improve their returns on invested capital. What does that mean? It means that BlackRock and other investment funds are going to buy up infrastructure, and their rich clients are going to get richer and richer, while average people have to pay to use basic infrastructure. BlackRock noted that GIP, the company that it's buying, already manages over $100 billion in client assets across infrastructure, equity, and debt, with a focus on energy, transport, water, waste, and digital sectors. So what does this mean? It means that your local government may privatize the water grid or the power grid or the garbage disposal service, or it might simply privatize the roads, and they will be bought up by some of these asset manager funds on Wall Street, and they will hike up the prices, charge monopoly rents, charge you more and more fees to use these basic services. And BlackRock already has $50 billion of its assets under management invested in some of these infrastructure projects. BlackRock CEO and chairman Larry Fink, the billionaire oligarch who spoke at the G7, in this press release, he noted, quote, infrastructure is one of the most exciting long-term investment opportunities. And he noted that policymakers are only just beginning to implement once-in-a-generation financial incentives for new infrastructure projects, which BlackRock, of course, is going to invest in to make its clients even richer. This is already happening. In fact, this May, it was announced that GIP, the BlackRock-owned infrastructure company, is part of a consortium that is buying up Malaysia's airports. So Malaysia is privatizing dozens of airports, And GIP, owned by BlackRock, is one of the main investors buying them up, along with the sovereign wealth fund of the United Arab Emirates. And I should point out that Malaysia is a very important country in Southeast Asia, where the US has been trying to pressure Malaysia to reduce its ties to China and reduce its business with China. And now we see US asset management companies are taking control of strategic airport infrastructure in Malaysia. So there's also, of course, a major geopolitical component of this. And it goes without saying that BlackRock is very well connected politically. Of course, it manages the wealth of many of these billionaire oligarchs who control Western governments. And I should point out that BlackRock veterans basically run or help to run Joe Biden's Treasury Department. So they play a key role in guiding US government policy on behalf of their billionaire clients. And another major US investment company on Wall Street, Blackstone, is funding the campaign of Donald Trump as he runs for president. And Blackstone's billionaire CEO Stephen Schwarzman is the highest paid CEO on Wall Street. And in fact, BlackRock emerged out of Blackstone in the 1980s. Blackstone originally held 50% ownership in BlackRock. And as I explained in a recent video, which I will link to in the description below, BlackRock and its billionaire CEO Larry Fink are more closely linked to the Democrats and fund Democrats, whereas Blackstone and its billionaire CEO Stephen Schwarzman are some of the major funders of the Republican Party. Blackstone has been investing for many years in infrastructure, and it's the world's largest landlord. The Guardian noted that Blackstone, I'm quoting here, Blackstone is the largest commercial landlord in history. It has quietly taken control of apartment blocks, care homes, student housing, railway arches, film studios, offices, hotels, logistics warehouses, and data centers. Blackstone doesn't just own real estate, it owns everything. That's what the Guardian newspaper wrote. Just in the United States, Blackstone owns and manages more than 300,000 units of rental housing, which makes it the biggest landlord in the entire country. And whereas BlackRock had traditionally been a more traditional investment company, buying up stocks and bonds, now increasingly, BlackRock is buying up infrastructure just like Blackstone, which is an alternative investment company. We saw a prime example of this June when a report came out showing that in a city in Texas called Fort Worth, in that city, over 25% of all of the residential homes are already owned by investment companies and commercial interests. So these investment funds are literally buying up homes, which, by the way, is a major reason that housing prices have gone up and up, making them unaffordable for average people, which means that a lot of people in the US, especially young people, instead of just renting, their landlord is not even some rich person. Their landlord is an investment company that is investing on behalf of oligarchs. And you know what's funny is BlackRock now has the world's largest Bitcoin fund, which is very funny because you'll see a lot of right-wing crypto bros who will say that Bitcoin is the solution to everything. We just need Bitcoin. But in reality, this Bitcoin Ponzi scheme is now being completely dominated by big institutional investors like BlackRock, which has a $20 billion exchange-traded fund that is an ETF. And BlackRock is not the only one. There are other major investment funds that have created ETFs that are listed now that you can buy from a broker and you can invest in. So what this shows is that Bitcoin is actually not an alternative. You cannot change the system from within because you will never be able to compete with these big institutional investors like BlackRock that literally have over $10 trillion of assets under management. They control the system, and anything within the system will eventually be consumed, absorbed, co-opted by them. Bitcoin and crypto are not in any way an alternative. they are part of the very same system. So the point to take away here is that these investment companies on Wall Street are gobbling up infrastructure around the world, not only in the West, but in poor countries in the global South. And their goal is to monopolize this infrastructure, to charge monopoly rents to make their clients even richer. And what this shows is the extreme hypocrisy of mainstream economists who claim that capitalism is always so efficient because private enterprises are more innovative and more efficient. But in reality, what we see is that there is an inherent tendency in capitalism toward monopoly, that wealth concentrates in fewer and fewer hands. And what happens is that these big financial institutions realize that the fastest way to boost their wealth, it's not to invest in companies that provide tangible goods. Because if you really want to get rich, you don't do it by creating a product that people want to make their lives better and more comfortable. No. If you want to be a millionaire, you can be an industrialist. But if you want to play in the big leagues, if you want to be a billionaire, you get involved in finance, in speculation, and instead of actually investing in a product, which, that's seen as something that's inferior, you don't want to dirty your hands. Instead, you shouldn't get involved in investment and buying up monopolies, the natural monopolies of the economy, things like infrastructure. It's really difficult to have competition for roads and bridges and hospitals. Instead, the government should provide these services and invest in this infrastructure as part of the natural monopolies, the utilities like water and electricity. It's very difficult to have competing water grids or competing power grids. Instead, this is a public good that should be provided by the government. But instead, what we've seen in the neoliberal era that began in the late 1970s and 1980s with the rise of free market fundamentalism, instead we saw that more and more mainstream economists and Western governments told everyone that the most efficient way to run these services is to privatize them. So instead, the natural monopolies were sold off to private for-profit companies, which simply hike up prices and seek economic rent, not actual production. So what we're seeing is that our economies in the West are moving more and more toward basically feudalism. Capitalism is devolving into neo-feudalism, and these big capitalist oligarchs have become so powerful that instead of just buying up companies, they're buying up our water grid, our electrical grid, our roads, our bridges, and Western governments led by politicians who are funded by these billionaire oligarchs. They are working hand in glove with these investment companies in order to build more and more privatized infrastructure in global South countries and in the West. And they are creating basically a neo-feudal system run by this small handful of capitalist oligarchs. And this explains the famous quote from the World Economic Forum. Back in 2018, it published a video that went viral because in the video, they famously said, quote, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." And a lot of right-wing conservatives, they were like, this is an example of how the World Economic Forum is trying to impose socialism, which is ridiculous. It's actually the exact opposite of socialism. This is the logical end road of capitalism. Over hundreds of years, capitalism has led to further and further concentration of wealth in fewer hands, to such a degree that now you have individuals like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates who have hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth, whereas there are still hundreds of millions of people on Earth who don't have enough food to eat and are on the verge of starvation. So what has happened over time is that capitalism has monopolized so much wealth in so few hands that now these oligarchs are buying up assets all around the world. They are literally buying up houses that you live in. They are buying up roads and hospitals. They are buying up everything, and soon you will own absolutely nothing, and a small handful of capitalist oligarchs will own everything, and you will have to pay them rent in order to use your house. It's not your house, it's their house. In order to use the house that you live in, you have to pay them rent. In order to use the car that you maybe have, you have to pay them rent. In order to drive on a road, you have to pay them rent because they own the road. In order to go to school, you have to pay them because they own all of the schools. They own everything. The economy is looking more and more like the feudal economy of the Dark Ages in Europe, but instead of a hereditary, well, actually, many of these capitalists are hereditary, but instead of, monarchs, you have capitalists like Jeff Bezos and like Elon Musk, and they will maybe hand down their wealth to their, children, and they will control everything. This is the exact opposite of socialism. And in fact, if you look at current socialist countries or former socialist countries, they have the highest home ownership rates on earth. So for instance, socialist countries like China, Cuba, or Laos, for instance, Vietnam, they have home ownership rates of over 60%. Or in former socialist countries like Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, they also have home ownership rates of over 90%. Because this is a product of the fact that in the socialist period, they all lived in public housing. And then after the end of the socialist governments, they were able to own the homes that they live in. Or in socialist countries like China, 90% of people live in their house. They don't pay a landlord rent. And furthermore, as Foreign Policy magazine pointed out, in China, only 18% of homeowners actually have a mortgage, which is to say that 82% of homeowners in China, the vast majority of the population, they do not have a mortgage. They completely own their house. The situation is completely different in the US, where 66% of people own their houses in scare quotes. However, they actually don't own the house because for the majority of them, their house belongs to the bank because they have mortgages. In reality, only 39.3% of homeowners in the US completely own their homes. That is to say that over 60% have mortgages. That means that the bank owns the house of 60% of homeowners in the US. And by the way, this is a record high level of full homeownership, which is largely because baby boomers own their houses, but a lot of young people do not own their houses. So if 65.6% of Americans own their homes, but only 39.3% actually completely own their homes, that means that only 25.8%, only 26%, or just over 1/4 of Americans actually fully own their homes. The majority of so-called homeowners are not actually homeowners. The bank owns their home. This is the reality of actually existing capitalism, not these boogeyman stories of socialism. The World Economic Forum is the opposite of socialist. It represents capitalist billionaire oligarchs around the world, like BlackRock, and it represents both major political parties in the US and other political parties across the West, which is why every US president always speaks at the Davos conference, including Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And of course, Trump himself is a billionaire. And when he was president, he cut taxes on rich billionaire oligarchs like him. And now as he campaigns for president, being funded by billionaire oligarchs from Blackstone and other Wall Street firms, he's pledging to further cut taxes on the rich, and he wants to cut taxes on corporations so they can have even more money to invest in rent seeking and what essentially is neo-feudalism. The final point that I need to stress here is that this trend of the rich getting richer is inherent in the capitalist system. This was shown by a very mainstream French economist, Thomas Piketty, in his famous book, Capital in the 21st Century. And in this award-winning book, He showed using empirical data that over time, in the long term, the rate of return on capital is larger than economic growth. What does that mean? It means that we cannot simply keep growing the economy and expect inequality to get better. It will only get worse because rich people's wealth grows faster than the economy itself. The system has to change. Now, the mainstream French economist Thomas Piketty, he called for a global progressive tax, which is the bare minimum, and even that is seen as radical. In reality, the global capitalist system must fundamentally change, or if not, as the World Economic Forum said, you will own nothing and you'll be happy. This is the logical conclusion of capitalism. The system must fundamentally change, but the reality is that Western governments, which of course are working hand in glove with institutions like the World Economic Forum, they represent the very same billionaire capitalist oligarchs on Wall Street who are benefiting from all of this. Those capitalists fund politicians who run Western governments. And then they meet at the G7 and they all talk about how they can work together in order to enrich the rich even further. So I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but there needs to be a fundamental transformation of the global economic system, or this will get worse. I'm not gonna, sugarcoat it. This is the reality. And on that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this, and I'll see you all next time.